here to introduce a very, very talented, very impressive individual. Dr. Ruha Benjamin is a graduate from Spelman College. She graduated from there with a BA in Sociology and Anthropology. She then went on to obtain a master's degree and a PhD in Sociology at UC Berkeley. And then she went on to be a postdoc at UCLA, and she was most recently a visiting fellow at Harvard University in the program for Science, Technology, and Society. Sorry. She is now assistant professor at Boston University, and she is also the author of a book titled People Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier. So she's very impressive from this CV, of course, but we're particularly excited to have someone who very much understands the importance of empowering people and the role that technology and science can play to help or undermine this goal. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you. Thanks, Colin. Hi, everyone. It's really my honor to be invited. I was surprised, but also delighted to get the invitation to come back to MIT. And so I want to thank the graduate women at MIT, the organizers, for inviting me to share some thoughts today, which I've titled Playing the Game or Hacking the System. And I should say, this is really an earnest question for me, not just a kind of rhetorical provocation. I don't come to you today with any kind of 10-point platform on how to do the latter, but rather as someone who's actually still very much struggling and expect to be struggling lifelong to find ways to not simply fit in, but to stretch out the spaces in which I work and teach. For that reason, I hope we can think together today about how to not only navigate, but transform academic, industry, and policy worlds together, with this emphasis on the dimension of collective action together. But first, I want to start with two very short YouTube clips to get our creative juices flowing and to sort of serve as a metaphor of sorts of what I envision when I think about what social hacking might look like. And this goes on. And it culminates. Now I imagine her 15 years later, 10 years later, the next clip. Not the same person, but I imagine the connection between the two. 10. All right. So there's so much that I love about those two clips. And I sort of have to return to them and sort of excavate, in our social and cultural milieu examples like this of people who are transforming the spaces in which they work and play. And one connection, there are many connections I see between those, and I'm just going to mention one, and then I'd love at the when we open it up for discussion to just hear your reflections. But one is like when I think about this little girl, one of the things that I imagine, besides the awesome choreography in her head, which she's like, I wish the teachers would have understood my brilliance, is I also kind of see her dance as a sort of rebellion against those flesh-colored tights, right? Those tights that I'm sure they're called flesh-colored, and they don't match her, and I sort of see her dancing like, forget these tights, I'm going to show you. And then fast forward, her in the future is what I imagine, and she either is liberated from those tights or she found some tights that match her, or just one little sort of symbol about the connection in which they're sort of owning these spaces. And I start with these two examples of what we might dub a kind of aesthetic hacking to connect us to our own stories of childhood deviance and creativity. As adults trying to navigate spaces that were not created with all of us in mind, I think it's vital that we stay in touch with that part of ourselves, tapping into seemingly small moments of subverting the status quo as a starting point for our conversation today. And with one huge caveat, that despite the kind of feel-good nature of the YouTube clips, we shouldn't expect the cheering or the amusement or the perfect scoring, like the kind garnered by the performances we watched. Because offstage, in institutions such as the ones we work in, challenging systems of power and privilege is typically threatening, not entertaining. So I draw inspiration from these two young girls, but I also want to acknowledge the limits of using their incredible performances as a metaphor. And at the same time, I think one of the points of building community, like the one that the graduate women of MIT are doing, is precisely that we need to cheer one another on, we need to amuse one another, we need to lift each other up in our collective struggles against business as usual. In the process, I really want us to tap into our own stories and those of social hackers who've come before us. And so as one more sort of laying the groundwork for our conversation, I want to reflect a moment on this collective inheritance by focusing on one individual, Bessie Coleman, who in the 1920s was the first American of any gender and ethnicity to earn an international aviation license. She's among our predecessors who showed us what it looks like to literally fly and be fly, looking down from her plane. No one could really make her stay in her lane, in her place, as she knew that this earthly race didn't apply in the sky. She was as stubborn as they come, and then some. I refuse to take no for an answer, she once said. My people shouldn't have to experience what I did. So she opened a flight school instead, an aviator, like one of Olivia Pope's gladiators. Defying the odds, this was a time when folks were still sitting on the bus at the back. She was a rule breaker, game changer, social hacker, refusing to follow the rules of the game, lifting us all up by the draft of her plane, urging us to risk being labeled insane, to fly and be fly. So with this acknowledgement of our socially deviant predecessors and feminist ancestors, let's continue. In the social sciences, there's this concept you may be familiar with called code switching. It's gone mainstream recently with NPR calling its new blog on race and ethnicity Code Switch. This is a term used to describe something we all do to some degree as we navigate different social and cultural spaces by changing the way we speak and interact to fit in. Social lubrication, we might call it, that we learn to do from a very early age. So for example, as a kid, the way I interacted with the cashier of the corner store was different than how I interacted with my third grade teacher. Or even now, when I take my sons to the barber on Tremont Street, my mannerisms with the Caribbean owner takes on a different style than when I run into my dean later that same day. The point is that we all tend to be more formal and buttoned up in some settings and more casual and colloquial in others. This code switching is one of many ways in which we, quote unquote, play the game of life, garnering respect and advancing in our work life that for many of us tends to be predominantly middle class, white and masculine settings, all while maintaining connections to community, friends and family outside of work. But accepting this as just how it is, the concept of code switching tends to hide something rather crucial, which is that not all codes, that is, ways of being in the world, were created equal, because not all social milieus can exert the same power, rewards, and consequences over those that conform and those that don't conform. And while most of the research on code switching has tended to focus on ethno-racial codes and to lesser extent class codes, we could easily brainstorm a list of the ways that women tend to code switch when they move from a setting that's predominantly female to one that isn't. From the change in body language, decrease in assertiveness, to an increase in giggling even. These are all the ways we learn from a young age to perform gender. And in fact, these default gender codes that continue to shape daily life are what make a conference such as this so incredibly important. But the point I really want to get back to is this, that when we move through different social worlds, each with their own unspoken rules of interaction, these are not parallel universes, but stratified ones. Stratified because judgment and scrutiny of speech and dress and style are often directed against those who have least power by those who have more. Which is why, for example, in our rape culture, the burden continues to fall on women rather than men to prevent rape. And you'll notice the don't rape me training we impart is often in terms of telling women to, quote, stop asking for it in coded language, right? That is, with their dress and speech and body language. Instead, and here I know I'm preaching to the choir a bit, we should be training men, and here I'm particularly invested as a mother of 2 sons, to stop misreading those supposed codes. Cultural codes, in other words, are not neutral, nor are all codes created equal. They reflect particular values and interests and forms of social organization that allow some people to impose their values on others. And to be successful, we are told, we must master the dominant codes, learning, in short, to play the game of life. A game in which the rules have been created by someone else. What I want to suggest to you today is that while playing the game may indeed benefit us as individuals, we owe each other so much more. Those of us who are or will be in positions to navigate spaces where decisions and influence and power reside, namely all of us, must find ways to use our outsider within position, to use Patricia Hill Collins' phrase, to not simply try to get others to conform to the existing codes, a politics of respectability and self-empowerment, as it were, but to instigate a much more fundamental kind of social change through hacking these systems of power in privilege in small and large ways. So let me pause for a moment on this idea and break down what I mean by these competing metaphors, gaming versus hacking the system. These, as you know, are 2 widespread ways in which people engage with technology in a literal sense, and I want to use them figuratively to illustrate 2 ways we can approach life more broadly. The first mode of engagement is typically characterized by recreation, competition, and consumption. That is, we use and play with, but don't create the technological platforms and social systems that we set out to game. The second mode, hacking, is typically characterized by some form of mastery, collaboration, and creativity. That is, to hack a system, one needs in-depth understanding of how it works, what are its strengths and weaknesses, and a vision for how it could be better. These insights allow us to subvert the system that we've come to understand and make it do something it wasn't meant to do. Make it do something it wasn't meant to do for the greater good. This, to me, makes it a potent metaphor for intervening in social systems that were not created with all of us in mind. When we begin to rewrite code rather than simply code switch, we can set out to embed new values and new social relations into the world. I'll give you one example among many of why it matters so much that we do more than play the game, by referring to the literal context of video games. And here you can tell I have a 10 and a 12-year-old. That's like, when we look at the world of video games itself and examine the connection between violence, gender, and race, researchers find that the majority of African American female characters, a full 86%, are either props, bystanders, or participants, but never competitors. Nearly 9 out of 10 African American females are victims of violence in these games, making them far more likely than any other group to be victimized. And more than half of the African American characters are quote unquote unaffected by the violence exacted upon them, with only a fraction exhibiting both pain and physical harm. Now, we might be tempted to dismiss the violence in these virtual worlds, but to do that, we'd have to ignore the fact that the line between virtual and physical worlds has been completely blurred. And the fact that for the moment we wake up in the morning to the time we go to sleep, we spend so many hours in virtual realities, in Facebook conversations, Twitter and Instagram interactions, and the list goes on. So that what people think and feel in so-called real life directly impacts and is impacted by these screen-mediated social relations. In other words, virtual worlds represent and shape our imagination, including what we value and desire, what we fear and hate. So the fact that the lives of Black women continue to be valued less and our deaths considered less tragic on the screen both reflects and shapes devaluation in our everyday lives. You might recall that on the opening weekend of the movie Hunger Games, many young white fans took to Twitter in order to express their disappointment that one of the characters they had come to love in the book didn't match their imagination, that their beloved Rue was not, quote, a blonde-haired white girl with whom they could relate innocence. This set off a string of vehement tweets among fans, with one writing, "Call me racist, but when I found out Rue was Black, her death wasn't as sad." So hold that thought for a minute and let's shift from the virtual to physical. What I'm insisting upon is that this same attitude towards Black life is what allows the city of Boston to choose the predominantly Black neighborhood of Roxbury as the place to put 12 out of 15 trash transfer stations, letting off all kinds of pollutants in the air so that the asthma rates in this one neighborhood are exponentially greater than in other parts of the city. When we see Black video game characters unaffected by the violence exacted upon them, and white fans unaffected by the death of a once beloved character because she's Black, and city governments indifferent to the Black children forced to breathe in toxic air, I'm reminded of Elie Wiesel's point that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And this is why it's so urgent that we in this room not simply play the game, but rather flip the script and subvert this unjust social system. Our lives and the lives of so many others who will never have the chance to sit where you're sitting today depend on it. In the words of the brilliant and incisive Audre Lorde, if I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies for me and eaten alive. Eaten alive. In virtual and physical worlds, if we let other people define us and write our scripts and code our characters and plan our neighborhoods, and so then if we turn Audre Lorde's insight inside out, as we must, then if we define ourselves for ourselves, we will be liberated by our own vision of our lives, and we will thrive. Self-definition, however, is necessary, but not sufficient. In this way, what I'm saying shouldn't be confused with a kind of self-help manifesto, however important that may be for some, however empowering that may be for individual success and happiness. Rather, collective well-being and justice requires that we identify the viruses in the current system that our elite social positions may provide temporary immunity from, but that in fact make us all deadly sick. Our collective well-being depends on debugging persistent forms of violence and inequity and creating new things, new practices, and new forms of life, to borrow anthropologist Chris Kelty's insistent phrase. Let me provide two examples of what it might look like to begin questioning the values and interests coded in the current system. Last year, President Obama committed $100 million for a national brain initiative. He said he wants to explore America's next great frontier in science, mapping the human brain. As with all big science undertakings that seek to win public favor, the president said this initiative could eventually help scientists cure and even prevent diseases, from Alzheimer's to traumatic brain injury. What he didn't say is that some researchers are also already using neuroimaging, namely brain scans, to predict whether criminals will break the law again. A kind of Minority Report 2.0, in which I presume Attorney General Eric Holder is playing the role of Tom Cruise. One researcher doing this work recently explained to NPR that, quote, "We know that important decisions are made every day in the criminal justice system about, for example, whether and under what conditions to release an inmate. And one of the things that parole boards typically do is some form of what's called risk assessment, to try to identify the factors that are likely to promote persistence to future crime. One of those variables," he said, "is impulsivity." Now, mind you, when I heard this story as I was driving to work, I was feeling rather snarky and wondered, why prisoners? Why prisoners? Why not, say, Wall Street bankers? My best friend is a banker, mind you, so I have nothing personal against bankers. But I do think Americans would feel a lot safer in their homes, hint, hint, if the Obama Brain Initiative would set up scans in front of the headquarters of like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan to test for impulsivity. So jokes aside, my point is, as MIT students, what and who we choose to study and with what framing questions form the social infrastructure of science. Research on impulsivity and criminal behavior among prisoners instead of bankers, for example, unwittingly reproduces racial and class inequities, independent of the intentions of researchers. That is, precisely when we do not think about the socially embedded assumptions of our work, it may turn out to be less objective and useful to society than we hope. And here I should point out that the neuroscience crime interface is particularly urgent and meaningful because of how many young people have received the counterpart to the degree you will receive from MIT, that is, a negative credential in the form of a criminal record. They already live in a version of Minority Report, in which they've been suspected of committing a crime long before they ever do. Supposedly hardwired to be impulsive, a brain scan then may end up becoming yet another tool to create unreasonable suspicion. Along these lines, following the tragic massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, researchers are now attempting a detailed study of the DNA of Adam Lanza, apparently the first time scientists will genotype a mass murder. Supporters of this work claim that, quote, understanding the genetics of violence might enable researchers to find ways to intervene before a person commits a horrific crime. Others warn that scientifically, not only would that goal be difficult to achieve, but that the pursuit of it risks jeopardizing personal liberties. Quote, some scientists shudder at the thought of labeling people potential violent criminals. A geneticist and neurologist at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Robert Greene, commented, it's almost inconceivable that there's a common genetic factor to be found in mass murders, and that I think it says more about us that we wish there was something like this. Such studies, in turn, tend to focus our attention away from the variety of socio-political factors that lead to such a tragedy, not least of which is the accessibility and proliferation of firearms. Pouring resources into understanding the molecular causes of mass murder isn't only risky for people with mental illnesses who may be stigmatized, but for everyone else who must live in a society in which there are 101 guns for every 100 people, with over 30,000 firearm deaths every year. So perhaps instead of studying the DNA of mass killers, we might consider redirecting some of that attention to genotyping members of Congress and find out what predisposes many of them to chronic heedlessness. And then perhaps, maybe one of you can found a company that's willing to patent a genetic test for that congressional trait, so we can check the results before voting. But wait, last year, gene patents are no longer legal, right? So, as many of you well know, the US Supreme Court refused to uphold the gene patents for a mutation that predisposes some women to develop breast or ovarian cancer. When I first heard the news, I imagined Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine, grinning in his grave. When a reporter asked Salk who owned the patent for the vaccine, he responded, well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Despite the seeming SCOTUS victory, it's important to note that the patent was for a mutation that affects less than 1% of women in the US. And yet many of the non-genetic factors tend to get overshadowed by the focus on biological predisposition. Exhibit A, Angelina Jolie's New York Times op-ed, My Medical Choice, in which she describes her decision to undergo a double mastectomy because her genetic test results came back positive and because her mother and grandmother died of the illness. This is a world in which we're called upon to be brave medical consumers, if we can afford it. A little sidebar, hours after the Supreme Court decision, the price for the test that Jolie took dropped from over $3,000 to $1,000. This was great news for those who have reason to be tested. Even so, by overemphasizing genetic risk and surgical intervention, we risk losing sight of the many other factors that contribute to cancer. And even more fundamentally, our capacity as engaged citizens too easily gets reduced to being savvy consumers. So while a part of me really applauds this whole movement that encourages women to take ownership of our health, I think we have to interrogate forms of ownership that too often come in the slick packaging of empowerment. For that reason, I tend to be a little more inspired by one Mr. Vernon Bowman, who recently demonstrated the potential tyranny of ownership. Bowman is the Indiana farmer who defied Monsanto's seed patent. Like other farmers, he had signed a contract with the company promising not to save seeds from the resulting crop, which means farmers have to buy new seeds every year. The seeds, as you'll recall, are valuable because they're resistant to the herbicide Roundup, itself a Monsanto product. But Bowman discovered a loophole for a second, riskier crop later in the growing season. And when Monsanto sued him, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that farmers could not use the company's patented genetically altered soybeans to create new seeds without paying the company a fee. Bowman's stubbornness and creativity reminds us that being an engaged citizen may sometimes be at odds with being a diligent consumer of all the new patented goods that come to market. In less than 3 decades, a handful of companies have engineered a fast and furious corporate enclosure of this first link in the food chain. Monsanto, for its part, accounts for almost 1/4 of the global proprietary seed market and enables the company to raise prices unencumbered. Perhaps then, following the Gandhian model in which Indians staged assault satyagraha, which translates to insistence on truth, demanding an end to the British salt monopoly in colonial India, it's time for a 21st century seed satyagraha. In fact, thousands of farmers have joined forces to pledge nonviolent non-cooperation with seed monopolies. The creative side of this movement, led by Vandana Shiva, is that they're saving seeds, trading seeds, and farming without corporate dependence. We fight, we dare, we end our hunger for justice. These are the real Hunger Games. I think of the seed satyagraha as the kind of biopolitical hacking that challenges the savvy, celebrity-mediated consumption model of empowerment. It's the kind of movement that I have to remind myself exists when I hear, for example, the founder of the direct-to-consumer company, genetic testing company 23andMe, say stuff like this. We envision a new type of community where people will come together around specific genotypes, and these artificial barriers of country and race will start to break down. Mirroring the hope of a post-racial society that many believe will result from personal genomics. The community envisioned here is conveniently predicated on purchasing services from her company. Community for sale. And while we're busy connecting with others who share our genetic makeup, solidarity with farmers in India or India seem more far-fetched and harder to imagine. This is the biopolitical reality we have to challenge, one in which people and companies are poised to sell us feel-good community, now often in a test kit, rather than the kind of hard-won solidarity which doesn't come bar-coded, the kind of space which this conference helps create. To that end, I remind you of the words of civil rights activist Bayard Rustin, and here I'm going to start winding down. We need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. Angelic troublemakers come social hackers. If, as Chris Kelty theorizes, in the 21st century, hacking and programming must be understood as forms of free speech. And when this form of expression is monopolized by a small elite, other forms of expression and ways of representing the world fail to take shape. So by hacking systems of power, we're questioning the ventriloquism of the few who purport to speak on behalf of the many. And we refuse to simply remain consumers of the reality created by others. Instead, we insist on becoming creators ourselves, crafting life worlds that foster the well-being, the intelligence, and potential of our wider communities. As one of many, many examples of this kind of work, electrical engineer Kimberly Bryant started the organization Black Girls Code, which is dedicated to training young people to create their own virtual realities. In the same way, I'm entreating you to not simply code switch and play the game of life, but rewrite wider social scripts. Our collective well-being depends on your ability to use your insider knowledge in a wide variety of professional fields to change things from the inside out. The time for us to be satisfied as diversity tokens, one of a few women or people of color in the fields that we work, is over. We need to supplant tokenistic inclusion with social transformation, embedding new values and new social relations into the world. And unlike the applause that greeted the incredible tap dancer and gymnast at the beginning of my talk, we should prepare ourselves for various levels of rejection, discomfort, and hardship. I love this kid. Because challenging the status quo is hardly ever welcome off stage. While the idea of code switching is about fitting in and leaning in to play the game created by others, what we really need more of right now is far more people to stretch out the arenas in which we work, to become more inclusive and just. I'll close then with the words of one of my favorite writers, Arundhati Roy, who says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing." As MIT graduate students, social aviators with cyborg wings, ask yourselves, what does it mean to understand existing forms of knowledge and power so thoroughly that you can potentially transform them in your image? I'm genuinely interested in your answers as a fellow traveler and co-conspirator. Thank you.